Binding is a very helpful way to make straps, necklines, around skirts, even if you would prefer it instead of cuffs. You can bind almost anything you can use a band for. So there's two kinds. There is single fold binding and there's double fold binding. If you went to the fabric store and you were looking in the quilting department, you'll see bias binding. It's the same concept. This is just with knit because we are using it on stretch garments. I'm going to show you the differences and the similarities. Single fold binding is easier, but you have the limitations of it's not great to use on straps where you want the finished edge completely encased, and you cannot use it on wovens. It needs to be a knit that doesn't unravel. But they both start out the same. So usually a binding, if it's a knit binding, it's going to be shorter than what you're binding it to. We usually use 90% for bindings and neckbands. Different fabrics require different amounts, but that's just a general start. So this is my garment, and this is the binding that I am going to be binding along this edge. So I'm a fan of memory pressing because I feel like it makes it a little easier in the end. So with my binding, I turn it wrong side up, and I'm going to memory press it in half. All right, trying to work around the camera and not burn myself here. So you can see that's the middle, and that is what is going to be bound here. So in order to encase both of our raw edges, we're first going to press this. You can see we're going to press the bottom edge up to the center. And then we're going to flip it around and do the same thing. If you're doing single fold, you don't need this press. Sorry, again, I'm trying to work with the iron and trying not to burn myself. Okay. There we go. So you can see it's faint, but I have the 4 lines. Those are just to help guide me because we'll do more pressing as we put this together. So what you want to do is you want to line up your binding on one edge here. Okay. Now this binding I'm doing will finish out at 3/8 inches. Depending on the width of your binding, you might have to use a different seam allowance. If your binding is a thicker binding, like a 5/8 finished, then you'll need to use a 5/8 seam allowance. It was whatever the height is divided by 4. That is your seam allowance. So you secure it on one side. Stretch to fit on the other side. If you're doing a long strap or something to that, the pattern should give you indications on where you should be matching your pins. And then you're going to stretch it in between. So that it's evenly distributed throughout. So now I'm going to sew with a 3/8 seam allowance right along here. I am not going to serge it. The reason is that if you serge it, you cut off 1/8 of an inch, and you need that full seam allowance to wrap your binding around. I use a lightning bolt stitch. That's the best one. A very long narrow zigzag will work as well. So I'm going to sew right along there. All right. So I've sewn all the way across this. As I was sewing, I stretched my binding to meet the garment. You never want to stretch the garment itself. only the binding. So you can see this is my seam allowance here that we are now going to wrap this around. So turn your garment over to the wrong side, and you're going to press the seam allowance up towards the binding or down towards the binding, whichever way your binding is facing. You want to press it towards the binding. So now you can see that your middle memory press is now going to be, that's the middle memory press, is now going to be where we wrap this. So as a single fold binding, all you're going to do is wrap that here, give it a good press. Then flip it over, and you're going to top stitch right along here. If you are very accurate, you can top stitch in the ditch and put your stitches right here where it comes together. I don't usually. I do it about 1/8 onto the binding. Again, using a stretch stitch if you're knit, so it'll catch the binding on the other side. So then you're going to have this excess, and you'll have to cut that off, trim the extra binding. So that's single fold binding. Double fold binding encases this raw edge, and we're going to do that now. So a double fold binding, now that we've pressed our seam allowance to the binding, that's where this other memory press comes in. So you're going to take the raw edge of the binding and press it to the seam allowance. Not over it, just to it. Okay. And then we're going to do one more fold, and you're going to encase all the raw edges and the seam allowance. I pin or clip a lot in this section because it's really hard to keep it in place. So you're still stretching the binding to meet the garment, although the steam and the pressing has made it a lot closer match than it started out as. All right. So then we're going to top stitch. This time, when you top stitch, you need to be very, very aware of where the back is. You need to catch when you stitch. You're going to stitch, edge stitch right along the binding. You need to make sure you're catching the back as well, so everything stays together. And that is how you do single and double fold binding. And that's really all there is to it. Now that you know how you can choose the best binding for your project or be able to follow your pattern's instructions perfectly. Thank you for being here.